We're going to be looking tonight specifically of the relationship with Jonathan and David. And Lord willing, it's hard to call the preacher down for visiting with visitors, so we won't do that. Lord willing, next week Gary will be doing our class. And I just wanted to take some time, and this could actually be multiple lessons, but just to do this one thing, because we know David as the man after God's own heart. And when you look at any of the great figures of the Bible, they are that because of their life and who they are and what they do. But also when you look carefully, God has molded and worked and helped and provided in a number of different ways. And let me just give you the bottom line tonight as we begin. What I want to encourage each of us to think about is that it's more important to be the right kind of friend than to spend our time looking for the right kind of friend. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So if I just use the term, a really good friend, think about it, who comes to your mind? Oh, let me just mention something. I give blood, and I have a blood thinner, and anyway, that's how I looked after it got through. So I told my wife we need to have our DHS story right if we get put in separate rooms and if something happens. So I don't want this to be a distraction, so I just need to tell you I got a little bruise from giving blood. But just stop and think. When you look back through your life and you think, who was just a really good friend? While we were at Oklahoma Christian, there was a young man named David Wilson Steen, and he was just unique in every way. Everyone just called him Wilson, and he was never going to graduate. His mom and dad worked in the OU Medical Center, very sophisticated research people, and he could not do abstract math. He didn't have the facilities to do the upper math classes and other stuff. But Wilson knew everybody on campus by name. He knew where they were from. He knew what their major was, and he knew what the intramural schedule was. And he was harmless, but most of the girls wanted to have somebody between they and him in class because you just never knew quite what Wilson was going to do or say. And like I said, he was just harmless, but he was just unique. I'm in a class with Jim Wilson, who could just be a scream sometime, and Yvonne came in late, and we were in the conference room in DHS overlooking the parking lot in the gym. And the only seat left was next to Wilson, and so she quietly sat down and was just getting started. And a little bit, Wilson reached over and picked up her arm, and he said, "Yvonne, I think you've got the most beautiful veins I've ever seen in my life." She turns every shade of red. She tries to die. And that's what I'm saying. See, just harmless, but you just never knew. We should have just said amen and gone home, because every once in a while someone would just break out laughing. Of course, Jim Wilson didn't help that a lot. Wilson was not a Christian. He had attended the college church, and I checked the directory. At one time, he had signed the directory 37 times in a row, because if you're a visitor, you should sign the visitor's directory. And conscious and sincere. He loved Elvis Presley. Do you remember those cameras that had the little square thing on it? In a class I was with, he found out late that Elvis was coming downtown. He was on the next to the top row and took pictures of Elvis with this camera with the little square thing. And it was a pinpoint of this is the yellow, and this is the pink, and this is the red. And he knew every song that Elvis Presley had ever done. And in the dorm area where he lived, some nights they would put Elvis on, and Wilson would get a broom, and he was Elvis Presley. And people would literally crawl out into the hall to be able to breathe because he was just so into it. Well, Wilson had a special friend, and her name was Margaret, and they were cats of the same color, wonderful, wonderful people. We double dated with Wilson and Margaret. He treated her like a princess. He was just this wonderful, wonderful guy. Well, we've stayed in touch after school finished, and like I said, his parents were delighted for him to be there, knowing he would never graduate, but he was just such a wonderful person. We moved to Australia. It didn't occur to him how long it would take the letter to get there, so on the 13th of March, I would get a birthday card sent to me from the Norman Post Office. Sheila would get a birthday card sent on the 22nd of September. Heather would get one on the 9th of June. We would get an anniversary card on June the 15th. We would get, I hope you're enjoying the Republican Democratic Convention cards. We would just get a series of cards, and while he didn't have the facility to understand international postage and all this other stuff, he was loyal. And we never quite had a friend like Wilson. After he became a Christian, he started worshiping with the Alameda congregation, and one of my friends from Sayre was there, and he said, we had a open house Christmas party. We would always save something for Wilson to do because he wanted to come an hour early, and he would help, and then somewhere between 9:15 and 9:30, he would say goodbye to every person that came because he needed to go home and get to bed so he wouldn't go to sleep in church the next day. Wilson then sent cards to so many members in the Alameda congregation that when he died, they took up a trust fund, and the proceeds of that are a table out in the foyer that there are always cards for you to pick up to send to other people in honor of Wilson. And you see what I'm saying? Sometimes we are thinking about finding the right friend, where sometimes I think our focus needs to be more on being the right friend. And I say this respectfully. One of our closest friends did not have the mental capacity to do a lot of things that other people could do, but what did he do with the capacity that he had? And when I think of Jonathan and David from the farm, my dad would call these guys cats of two different colors. You can just hardly imagine the difference between a shepherd boy and the king's son, the prince. And yet these two young men are such a splendid example of both the spiritual concept and the example of friendship. So here's the central idea. David inspired a great sense of loyalty among his friends. And there's a whole bunch of other things that we're not going to get to. We're going to stick primarily with this one. And when you look at, Jesus makes the statement, love your enemies. And I was just reading through the Gospels one day, and I thought, how many times are they plotting and planning to kill him? And so when Jesus talks about love your enemies, it's not just some hypothetical, this might be a good thing to do. He's talking about people who just, every time he speaks, are going pick, 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 and trying to find something wrong. We're excited, hopefully Jeff will be able to be back with us on the 17th of September. But we've talked before, and when he was younger, he was in a church in Alabama, and he said an older, well-known preacher would come and always pulled out a 3x5 card, and he said initially thought, okay, he's going to make some thoughts or some notes. Oh, no. He would wait out in the foyer in front of other people and then dress Jeff down. Well, you should have done this, and you didn't do this, and you missed this verse. And he said every time he came, he said, thankfully it wasn't too often, he said, I knew I was going to get a beat down out in the foyer in front of other people. Contrast. David Roper was at Eastside for years. And even if he had to be creative, it was always intimidating. Here's this older man, very well studied, very thoughtful, I'm not going to really tell him anything he hasn't already known. But every lesson, even if he had to use good imagination, he found something good to say about the lesson that day. And one of my convictions is no one is suffering from too much encouragement. I'm in the office at Eastside a number of years ago, and maybe a 25-year elder was there, and straight as a soldier, not a lot of emotion, a wonderful guy, but just real straight. And he's wiping a couple of tears out of his eyes. And he had something in his hand. I went up and said, "Are you okay?" And he said, yes, I'm okay. And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, I've been an elder in this church for 25 years, and today I got a letter from our missionary from Australia thanking me for being an elder. And this is the first letter I've got from a member since I've been an elder the last 25 years. No one's suffering from too much encouragement. And when you look at these two opposites in life, there are some things in their life that just click. And we'll look at some possibilities and some contrast as we go through. But like Jesus, David is a polarizing figure. When he talks about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, that's not some hypothetical. You stop and think, how many years is he a man on the run from Saul? How many enemies does he have with the Philistines? And as we looked last week, his own family, his own sons. And the term King Saul is tall in stature, head and shoulders above everyone else, but kind of emotionally, he's kind of like an emotional midget. He's very sensitive. He takes things very, very personally, and what a contrast. But when we come to David, we'll find these terms. The Lord was with David. David is loved by Israel, and he's even loved by Saul's servants. And when you look at these two young men, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit different way in a second, one of the things that attracts them to each other is that they're both very bold in battle. And we'll see complete examples of this in just a second. But here's the other thing to think about. Both of these young men, in different ways, also had some severe critics, even within their own family. Do you remember when Samuel comes to the house of Jesse and, bring in the sons, and maybe this one and this one and this one, and God keeps saying no, and finally he says, well, is there anybody else? Well, yes. There's the little guy out in the field. And we'll see the same thing at times because of Saul's imbalance and his anger, even toward his own son. Different translations will say, you're the son of a perverse woman. You would hear a movie today say, you're just like the old woman, which we were not allowed to use that word at all, but it's a very derogatory comment. And here's what I want you to notice. Haven't we seen people who are drawn together, how do you want to say this? Either by their weaknesses or by their strengths or by their struggles. But in this case, these two young men are drawn together because of their strengths. And God is in a process all the way through David's life of helping him to become the man after God's own heart. And one of the ways that he does that is that he brings this young man, Jonathan, into his life. David is not in isolation. David always has a host and a group of people with him. And you will find that he travels. He's always inquiring of the Lord, is this what you want me to do? And what we find, and if you have the outline, we're about 3/4 the way down. Do you see the word kesed or hesed there? I haven't chosen to go into this in great detail. This is such a splendid word. Hesed or kesed is love with loyalty. Chesed is covenant love. Chesed is a commitment. And of all things, and this always just strikes me kind of, and odd's not the word, but you're in the book of Malachi when God says, you have broken the chesed, the covenant that you have made with your wife. And what we're going to find is that these two young men are going to make a lifetime commitment to seek the best for each other and for their families. And this is exactly the same kind of love that God shows toward us in so many different covenant relationships. David makes this statement, and we hadn't looked at it earlier, and I wanted to include this. This is 1 Samuel 20:3. David vowed again and says, your father knows that I have found favor in your eyes, and he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this or be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. And I've just thought this, how do you sleep at night when the king and all of his resources are trying to track you down? I mean, I literally just imagine someone stepping on a stick and you're wide awake. And this wasn't an overnight type thing. We're not told how many years, but it looks like a good part of Saul's reign until David moves down to the very southern part. He's being actively pursued by Saul, and Saul is trying to actually kill him. So this is my question. What does a shepherd boy and a prince have in common? Well, both of these guys are brave as lions. And if you remember earlier, and this will be in 1 Samuel 14, the Philistines have a corner on the market on anything to do with metal. And they have developed all kinds of technology, even to the point that the plowshares, which would break the soil, and the tools that the Israelites used, they had to go to the Philistines in order to sharpen them. And so the Israelites are kind of like sticks and stones and slings, and the Philistines have all this technology. Jonathan says to his armor bearer, let's go take them on. Two of them. If they say, come to us, then the Lord has given them into our hands. And God is involved. A complete rout eventually takes place. Bold as a lion. Are you with me? Yep. And these two guys make a charge on the entire Philistine army. Can I do this for a second? Kelly, can you imagine having 5 little rocks in a pouch and a sling and headed toward a potential 6 to 9 foot giant? I mean, do you know what I'm trying to say? Can you just imagine your breath be a little bit short, a little bit tense, and here you are headed out, to this fighting machine. And yes, I'm well equipped. I have 5 stones in my pouch and I've got a sling. And you see what I'm saying? One of the things that these two young men have in common is that both of them are just literally as bold as lions in terms of taking on the adversity and the challenges that are there. When you look at the back of the first page, and again, if you're visiting, there's outlines on both communion tables if you'd like to have one. Look at the statement about God. Jonathan is going to say to his armor bearer, come up after us, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. And then when David confronts the giant, then he says, I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. And as I've looked at this to me seems to be that major attraction between these two. I'm assuming Jonathan is present when David goes out to fight Goliath. And if you have been the one earlier that you and your armor bearer have taken on the whole army, can you just imagine can I use the term pulling for him, meaning wanting him to succeed, and yet at the same time kind of holding your breath and thinking, I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out. And when you look at these two young men, that is in common, but both of them share a spiritual bond, and that their physical activity is guided by their spiritual commitment to God. And the thing that is going to bond them together is this mutual respect in that regard. And so in their relationship, Jonathan and David choose to focus and strengthen themselves on the positive things in their relationship. May I use the word pity party? And you know what I'm trying to say? There are some people who are sometimes, and I'm not making light of people's affliction. I'm not doing that. But what I'm saying is that Lynn McMillan came 3 times when we were planting the church in Southwest Sydney. And we just talked about this casually, and it eventually happened. He said, sometimes a triangle can form between 3 or 4 people, and they can so negatively reinforce each other that the fellowship, the Word of God, the Spirit of God, anything that's good can't penetrate that if they only focus on either what's wrong or negative things. And as we moved back, we could just kind of see this triangle forming between these 3 ladies, wonderful girls, but they would get together and, well, what's wrong with the Americans? Well, Kent's lesson was too long on Sunday. And every time they got together, it was another negative reinforcement about this or this or this. And I promise you, if you're in a local church and looking for something to criticize, there's a lot to criticize if that's what you're looking for. Sadly, within a decade, all 3 of them had left the Lord, and all 3 of them's husbands had left them. And what happened? Just that negative attraction reinforced each other so much that they just developed this bond that immunized them from anything that was wholesome and good. Well, rather than focusing upon your dad's trying to kill me, which is a reality, or you're just like your mother, what's wrong with you, or you're just the runt, then these 2 guys choose to focus their relationship, especially on the things that they have in common with God. So, if you look at Roman numeral 2, here's some characteristics, and we're going to do these quickly and then look at some other things. We're going to come across this passage again. Jonathan's soul was knit to David. And we're going to come back to this term in a second, but that's such an eloquent expression. Their souls were knit together. And that's going to be part of the descriptive of what carries them through the jealousy of the father and the conflict and everything that happens. Jonathan initiates the relationship, but David reciprocates. And we find this expression, 1 Samuel 18:3. He loved him as his own soul. And here are 2 guys who are going to focus on doing things for each other that is for the good of each other. And let me try to say it this way, and it'll come up again. A part of what's so amazing to me is that Jonathan is potentially the next king. And he recognizes that God has anointed his friend David, and Jonathan is willing and encouraging his best friend to fulfill God's will and to become the king instead of himself. And some people could never get over that. I'm going to be the next king. And what's so amazing, well, you see the word selfless here a little bit later, is that primarily the relationship being about me. I would also use the word us, and the relationship was about the other person and looking out for their best being. You look at number 3, Jonathan gave David his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, and his girdle that held the things together. And those are basically his royal items. that would be hard to receive. And in a physical sense, it's like Jonathan is giving him the royal things that were his as the son of the king in acknowledgement of him wanting to become the next king. Jonathan is going to delight in David, and he's also going to protect him, and we'll talk about this in a second because Saul's trying to kill him. Jonathan is going to speak well of David to his father. Let me say it this way. I grew up in the church in Sayre, and like I said, there were 40 of us in our clan. We typically had 40 at Christmas and 90 to 100 at Thanksgiving. And Kent and I have talked about this. We can't remember, in the 20 or so years we were home, ever hearing our grandparents or our parents or our aunts and uncles say anything negative about the Lord's church. And just stop and think about that. 20 years, we can't remember anything ever negative being said about the Lord's church. Sheila and I have talked when she was growing up, she would go home with a family. There were 4 girls. And she said after a while, she nearly tried not to go. And she said on the way to eat, they'd usually go out to eat, it was either roasted preacher, barbecued song leader, or the prayer was too long. And then even during the meal, the main part of the conversation, going to eat and during the meal, was as if the critics had gotten together and checked off, here's all the things that didn't go right today. Do you want to guess how many of the 4 girls are faithful today? None of them. I'm sure this wasn't intentional, but by focusing upon those things, the parents effectively immunized them against the power of the gospel and the goodness of the church. And when you see these 2 young men in such, and this is life and death with both of them, in such difficult circumstances, they choose to focus upon each other's strengths, and they choose to be a support and a help. So you look at this term knit, and there are several things that you can look at, and it has to do with bonding. One person used the word chained. I'm not as happy with the word chained. I like the word knit. Their souls are knit together, and this was something that is a part of the harmony and the spirit that's there. They are going to make this covenant with each other. If you look at the second page, then Jonathan made a covenant with David, and he loved him his own soul. And I just did 4 terms at the top of the second page that I think describe this covenant relationship. It's selfless. So it's not primarily about me, and particularly from Jonathan. It is generous. He is looking out for the benefit and the good of his friend. It's thoughtful. And that's something that's just such an important quality in our friendship, seeking to be thoughtful and concerned. And it's spiritually minded. What I want us to look at, and this is a couple of verses here that to me kind of are like snapshots of this relationship. There comes a point in time after David has been a man on the run and so many things have happened, and remember twice he's within reach of Saul. Once is in the cave and once they're asleep, and they go in and take the sword and the water bottle. And so at a certain point in time, David becomes afraid. And just stop and think about this. We all do things out of fear that we won't do normally. And at some point, it's kind of like he's come to the end of the rope, and he's ran and he's ran and he ran. And you can just kind of see this, what have I done to deserve this? When is this ever going to end? How are we ever going to conclude this? And at a point in time, fear has become the primary paradigm in David's life. David remained in the stronghold in the wilderness in the hill country We're in 1 Samuel 23:14. In the wilderness of Ziph, Saul sought him every day, but God did not give David into Saul's hands. Sometimes you have a friend that can just kind of anticipate, we really should make a phone call, we really should be in touch, and notice what happens. Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David. And every time I read this, I kind of laugh, and I kind of think, here's the king looking all over the country, everywhere he can, trying to track him down, and Jonathan can kind of go straight to him. I don't know if they were informants or something else, but what a contrast. And also a part of the provision of God, that the king can't find him, but his friend knows where he's at. If you mark in your Bibles, here's a verse that's important to mark. Jonathan went to David, and he strengthened his hand in God. How do you repay a friend that when you're really at your wit's end and you're struggling, knows you well enough to know that things are going on, I know that you're struggling, and doesn't put him down and doesn't say, well, you should do better. And I'll use this at the very end. This is not in the Hebrew text, but this is in my mind. I think Jonathan came and gave David a new grip on God. How do you repay a friend who knows you well enough that when you're at a very low point in your life, can come alongside of you and strengthen your hand in God? When you look at this word, it has to do with to sustain, to encourage. It helped him to find strength. And how did he do this? Well, part of it was his physical presence. We will continue to do this, but you remember the simple little acronym? I can remember BLT. This is BLD. When I hear of an accident or something's happened, B stands for be there. And on the way, Lord, please do not help me to be either Eliphaz or Bildad or Zophar. An accident or something's happened, let me just be there. Sometimes your presence says something that words can't say. L is to listen. And the person can say anything they want to about what's happened, not going to have any judgment at all. And the D is, if you go to someone in real need and you're just there and you listen, at some point you may see something that you can do to serve them or to help them. One of my closest friends at OC, his brother was coming down 63rd Street and was coming over a hill, and the vehicle, probably going 70 miles an hour on the other lane, was in the wrong lane and hit him head on, and he didn't get a chance to hit the brakes and killed him on the spot. And go down to the hospital and talk with my friend and the mom, and she finally says to my friend, would you mind going to the funeral home and start making the arrangements for your brother and for my son? And so I said, let me go with you. And after everything was done, you looked and there were bruises on his hand because of the impact and everything else. And I just thought, one little bouquet of flowers could sit right there, and at least Mom wouldn't have to see the bruises of the accident. And sometimes we worry about what to do, we worry about what to say, and I try to remind myself, you don't have to say anything. And what did Jonathan do? More than anything else, his presence says something to David that is even stronger than anything that he can actually say. When they finally get to talking, he says, fear not. Don't be afraid. And then he's going to start focusing, this is what God is going to do. And how ironic. My father is doing this, 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 and this, and you're a man on the run, and yes, you're afraid. And David, look ahead. This is what God is going to do. The hand of Saul, my father, will not find you. God will protect you. 2, David, you are destined to be king. and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. See the selflessness? Can I use the term right-hand man? Here's the one who rightfully could become the king, and he says, you're going to become the king, and I will be next to you. And Saul knows that David is going to be king, and you go through this whole discussion, and Jonathan strengthened his hand in God, and they make a covenant with each other. You look at the next page, you will be king over Israel. This is trivial, absolute trivial in comparison to this. But if any of you know my younger brother, he is just a light bulb in a dark room. He loves nothing more than to be in a room with 50 people he's never met before, and before he leaves, he'll know who everyone is and what they're doing, and ta-da. And like, for example, and I've mentioned this, at Stillwater, one side will say orange, and the other side will say power. In Norman, one side will say boomer, and the other side will say sooner. Well, in Australia, especially when we play New Zealand, one side says Aussie, 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 and the other side goes oi, oi, oi. Well, I asked Nancy, where's Kent at? And she said, well, he's up at the tennis courts. One of our girls is playing tennis. Well, she's from Melbourne. It's April. Wind's blowing 30 miles an hour. In Melbourne, it's autumn, it's still, and it's calm, and she's out here in this windstorm trying to play tennis, and she's not having a good match. And I get there, and my brother goes over on one side of the court on the west, at the top of his lungs, by himself. He hollers, Aussie, Aussie, Aussie. And then he walks all the way around to the other side and goes, oi, oi, oi. You couldn't wipe the smile off her face because she's thinking, only Kent would know that that's something that's near and dear to us as Australians, and only Kent would be the cheering section on both sides. And she lost the match, but she just had this smile on her face because she thought, here I am just really struggling, and someone's come along and is just giving me a verbal, hang in there and do the best that you can. How would you like to compete with him as a brother for attention? You know, we'd been Oklahoma Christian for 3 years, and for maybe 3 weeks, I was his brother, and by the 4th week, he was my brother. It just switched. And that's just his nature. And when we have relationships like that, we either can cheer the strengths of the other person, or we can become jealous and cause friction and trouble from that. And what I continue to be amazed, especially by Jonathan, is his selflessness to encourage David to become, one, what God is calling him to do, and two, what is his future potential, and both of those are at the expense of where Jonathan would be without David in the picture. And he comes and strengthened his hand in God. Later, Jonathan's going to be killed with Saul, and David's going to give the eulogy about that. But David and his men are fighting 80 miles away. When they come back, their families have all been kidnapped. The people are angry. They're talking about stoning David. And here it comes again. What does David do? He strengthens himself in God. And he inquires of the Lord. The Lord says, yes, go. And they capture and bring their families back. But every time I read that, I think, isn't it easier by yourself to strengthen your hand in God when people are talking about stoning you, when your dearest friend has come to you at a really low point of your life and has helped you to do that? And I think the benefit and the positive example of what Jonathan did is something that would help David at a later time. When I read the book of Psalms, and you think again how many things are about David, 75 of our Psalms are written by him. I love this expression. The books of history tell us what Israel did, and the book of Psalms tells us what they felt. And as you read through the book of Psalms, just be thinking about of all the adversaries, all the struggles, and all of the enemies that David had, and how often words like rock, refuge, strength, and others will be used. 4 things, and we'll close with a short poem. Chuck Swindoll just had these 4 comments. A friend is someone who's willing to sacrifice. A true friend is a loyal defense before others. Intimate friends give people the freedom to be who they are rather than kind of make them who they want them to be. And a true friend is a constant source of encouragement. And this is where we began. When I read Jonathan and David, then a lot of times I just sit there and reflect upon this wonderful part of Scripture and think, it's more important to be the right kind of friend than simply to find the right kind of friend. It has been my joy in life to find, at every turning of the road, a strong arm of a comrade kind to help me onward with my load. And since I have no gold to give, and love alone must make amends, my only prayer is while I live, Lord, make me worthy of my friends. And I hope the next time you read through 1 Samuel, you'll come to that and think, wasn't it a blessing that Jonathan came and strengthened his hand in God? And by the grace of God, may you and I do that for others today.